Mavis Ngallametta started painting later in life as a senior woman. She was aged 64 in 2008 when she first picked up a paintbrush, and that came about through the Wik and Kugu Art Centre in Aurukun. Gina Elaine, who was the wife of the art centre manager at the time, decided to really engage some of the women with the art centre and decided then to facilitate these painting workshops using acrylic paints. And so instantly these works were very different to the men's work of the area because the men were working with natural pigments and natural fibres. However, the women's work were really celebratory, and so these beautiful colours are really expressing the life and the joy in and around Aurukun. And so we can see these beautiful swamp works, which are kind of the precursor to her later swamp works. And we can also see that in these works she's starting to work through some of her techniques and perspectives, such as in this work here. We can see that there are the swamp flowers in the centre, and what we can see in this work are these beautiful birds and snakes and flowers. And something that's really interesting for me looking at this work is that when I look into the centre at the swamp flowers, I'm not sure whether I'm looking down into the reflection of a swamp or whether I'm in the swamp physically myself and looking back up. And it's a really fantastic example of one of her early works that really plays with perspective and scale, and eventually becomes the precursor to a lot of her larger works. In this smaller work here, we can see these dotting patterns and these beautiful lines. And in a lot of her works, the lines are symbolic of streams coming out from inland out to the ocean. But for me, these lines also reflect the shimmering of the sunlight on top of the water. But at the same time, in this work, she explores many different months in one painting. And so the white and the yellow dots are actually symbolic of wattle flowers. And these wattle flowers bloom at different times of the year. So usually they would not be in bloom at the same time. But we can see here some of her early kind of forays into creating works that span many months or even many years, which is another really interesting characteristic of her work. In this early work called Wutan, which was painted in 2011, we can see Mavis kind of creating these different bands within the landscape. And so we have the boat and the ocean at the bottom, and then the shoreline, and then coming up into the mainland. And then we can also see again the trees, and the perspective starts to shift and really frame the canvas. And this is really symbolic of many of her later works, where she does separate the ocean at the bottom and then bands of the shoreline, and then eventually bands that appear to be aerial perspectives. And so this is one of her early examples of a shift in perspective in her work, where we kind of look like we're approaching the land from sea, or we're looking at the land from a 45-degree angle, looking down from a low-flying plane, for example. It's during this period that she's experimenting with acrylic, but then eventually she begins to experiment with this ochre, and she was really encouraged to work with her natural materials that she has been collecting and preparing for many, many decades herself. In these earlier works, she kind of keeps the acrylic and the ochre separate, and they're, small-scale works. And then eventually she starts to combine them. And so this work up the top here is a really early example of her using that beautiful, rich, deep blue with natural materials over the top. And after that 18-month, 2-year period, she begins to paint on larger and larger canvases. And that's when she really is able to use all of these artistic devices that she's been working on throughout her early career to be able to combine them into the one work. And that's kind of the moment that her work really flourishes, because she all of a sudden has enough space to be able to combine these really sophisticated patterns and bands and dots and perspectives all within the one artwork.